Case 1. Dr. Dirk Grinder. On the morning of October 31st, 1999, a Yale-educated physician with degrees from Yale Medical School and MIT walked a secluded trail in Wellesley, Massachusetts, carrying a hammer, a folding knife, and a pair of gloves. Dr. Dirk Grinder was 58 years old, a prominent pediatric allergist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and had been married to Mabel May Grinder for 31 years. He bludgeoned his wife to death with the hammer and stabbed her in the neck with the folding knife as she waited for him on the trail where they walked their dog every Sunday morning. The motive was to prevent her from discovering a secret life involving prostitutes, online escorts, and a hidden identity under the alias Thomas that would have destroyed his career and his carefully constructed image. Dirk K. Grinder was born around 1941 in Germany and immigrated to the United States as a child. He excelled academically, earning his undergraduate degree from Yale University, his medical degree from Yale Medical School, and a PhD from MIT. By 1999, he worked as a prominent pediatric allergist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston and was board certified, published, and respected in the medical community. He and May lived in Wellesley, one of the wealthiest communities in Massachusetts, and were active in local charities and social circles. To those who knew them, they appeared to be a devoted couple with 3 adult children. What no one knew was that Grinder had been living a double life for years. He maintained a secret online identity under the alias Thomas and used hidden credit cards, a secret post office box, and a separate cell phone to contact prostitutes and arrange encounters. He had constructed an elaborate system to conceal his activities from his wife, his children, and his colleagues. Mabel May Grinder, 58, was a registered nurse and health educator who had spent her career caring for others. She was a devoted wife and mother of 3 adult children, and she was beloved in the Wellesley community for her volunteer work and involvement in local charities. She had complete faith in her husband. On Sunday mornings, she and Dirk would take their dog for walks on the trails around Morse's Pond, a wooded area near their home. The walks were a routine part of their life together, a peaceful ritual that required no second thoughts about safety. On October 31st, 1999, at approximately 8 p.m., Dirk and May Grinder left their home and drove to the Morse's Pond Trail in Wellesley for their usual morning walk. They brought their dog with them. At some point during the walk, Grinder told May that the dog appeared to have a bad back and that he needed to return the animal to the car. He left May alone on the trail and walked back to the parking area. What he actually did was retrieve a hammer, a folding knife, and a pair of gloves that he had brought from home and hidden in preparation for the attack. He returned to the trail and ambushed his wife. He bludgeoned her with the hammer and stabbed her in the neck with the knife. May died at the scene. After killing her, Grinder disposed of the weapons and gloves in a nearby storm drain, assuming they would never be recovered. He then returned to the trail, flagged down a passerby, and called 911. When police arrived, he was frantic, yelling, "My wife! My wife! Somebody attacked her!" The cover story collapsed within hours. Police found no evidence of a random attacker or any signs of a struggle beyond the immediate area where May's body was found. Investigators searched the area and discovered the hammer, the folding knife, and a pair of bloody gloves in a catch basin near the trail. Forensic testing revealed DNA inside the gloves that matched Dirk Grinder. The DNA was touch DNA, transferred from his hands to the interior lining of the gloves when he put them on before the attack. It was a detail he had not anticipated. Investigators also discovered Grinder's secret laptop and conducted a forensic analysis of his internet activity. The analysis revealed his alias, Thomas, his extensive contact with prostitutes and escort services, his hidden credit card accounts, his secret post office box, and the cell phone he used to arrange encounters. The evidence painted a portrait of a man who had been living a double life for years and who had decided that killing his wife was preferable to letting her discover the truth. Grindr was arrested in May 2000 and charged with first-degree murder. He was denied bail. The trial began in May 2001 in Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham, Massachusetts. Judge Hiller B. Zobel presided over the proceedings, which lasted approximately 6 weeks. Assistant District Attorney Wayne Clemens led the prosecution and presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence and testimony from the women Grindr had hired. Several escorts took the stand and testified that they had met with Grindr under his alias, Thomas. The prosecution introduced the DNA evidence from inside the gloves, the deleted internet history from Grindr's laptop, the hidden financial accounts, and the weapons recovered from the storm drain. Clemens argued that Grindr had killed May to prevent her from discovering his sordid double life, which would have destroyed his reputation, his career, and his financial stability. The defense, led by attorney Martin Weinberg, argued that May had been attacked by a random assailant while Grindr was away with the dog. The defense could not explain the DNA inside the gloves or the elaborate system Grindr had constructed to hide his secret life. Grindr did not testify. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder on June 29, 2001. Gasps were heard in the courtroom, and Grindr's 3 adult children wept openly but continued to support their father and maintain his innocence. Judge Hiller B. Zobel sentenced Grindr to life in prison without the possibility of parole on June 29, 2001. In his remarks, Judge Zobel characterized the murder as a calculated and brutal betrayal of a woman who had spent 31 years as Grindr's devoted wife. The most shocking aspect of the sentencing hearing was the victim impact testimony. Grindr's 3 adult children spoke not on behalf of their mother, but in support of their father. They maintained that he was innocent despite the DNA evidence, the hidden life, and the jury's verdict. Grindr filed multiple appeals in the years following his conviction, challenging the validity of the DNA testing methods and the jury instructions. The defense also claimed that later DNA tests had revealed the presence of unknown male DNA at the scene, but the courts ruled that the new evidence was insignificant and did not undermine the overwhelming case against him. All appeals were denied by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. The appeals process continued until 2011. Grindr has no active appeals remaining. At 83, Dirk Grindr remains at MCI Norfolk in Massachusetts, serving life without parole. His inmate number is W6888181. He's been incarcerated for more than 2 decades. The case became the subject of national media coverage, including features on Court TV and Dateline NBC, and was documented in the book A Murder in Wellesley by Tom Farmer and Marty Foley. The town of Wellesley, known for its wealth and stability, was shattered by the revelation that one of its most respected residents had murdered his wife on a Sunday morning. The May Grindr Memorial Scholarship Fund was established in her honor. The 3 children who lost both parents that day have remained largely out of the public eye, though for years they maintained their father's innocence. The physician who had dedicated his career to healing children used that same intellect and precision to plan and execute the murder of the woman he had promised to cherish. Case 2. Todd Kohlhepp. On November 3, 2016, Spartanburg County Sheriff's deputies executed a search warrant on a 95-acre property in Woodruff, South Carolina, looking for 2 missing persons. As they walked the grounds, they heard a sound. It was banging, coming from inside a large metal shipping container. The deputies cut open the lock and pulled open the doors. Inside, they found a woman named Kayla Brown, 30 years old, chained by the neck to the wall. She had been held captive for months. When deputies asked who had done this to her, she gave them a name: Todd Kohlhepp. The man who owned the property was a successful real estate broker, a licensed pilot, and a registered sex offender who had built a second career after serving 14 years in prison for kidnapping and sexual assault. What investigators discovered over the following hours was that Kohlhepp had not only imprisoned Kayla Brown, but had also murdered 7 people over a span of 13 years, including 4 employees of a motorcycle shop in a 2003 massacre that had remained unsolved for more than a decade. Todd Christopher Kohlhepp was born on March 7, 1971, in Florida. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised in Georgia and South Carolina. At the age of 15, in 1987, he was convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and served 14 before being released in 2001. While incarcerated, he earned degrees in computer science. After his release, he registered as a sex offender and began rebuilding his life. He obtained a real estate license and eventually became a highly successful real estate broker, opening his own firm, TKA Real Estate. He also earned a pilot's license and accumulated significant wealth. To the community, Kohlhepp appeared to be a quirky but rehabilitated success story, a man who had overcome a troubled youth and built a legitimate career. In reality, he was using his wealth to construct a private killing ground. He purchased a 95-acre property in Woodruff, South Carolina, built fences around it, bought shipping containers, and stockpiled weapons. He even posted reviews on Amazon for items like padlocks and shovels, joking about their usefulness for restraining people and burying bodies. No one took the reviews seriously. The victims fell into 2 groups separated by more than a decade. The first 4 were employees of Superbike Motorsports, a motorcycle shop in Chesney, South Carolina. On November 6, 2003, Scott Ponder, 30 years old, Beverly Guy, 52, Brian Lucas, 29, and Chris Sherbert, 26, were working at the shop when Todd Kohlhepp walked in and shot them all to death with a 9mm handgun. Scott Ponder's wife was pregnant at the time of his death. Kohlhepp later claimed that he had been disrespected during a previous visit to the shop and that the massacre was an act of revenge. He cleaned the scene and left. The case went cold. The second group of victims was killed more than a decade later, between 2015 and 2016. Charles Carver, 32, Johnny Coxey, 29, and Megan McCraw Coxey, 25, were hired by Kohlhepp to perform odd jobs and clear brush on his property in Woodruff. They were people who needed money and saw Kohlhepp as a legitimate employer. Kayla Brown, 30, was also lured to the property and held captive in a shipping container, chained by the neck, for months. Kohlhepp told her that he had killed multiple people and that she would be next if she tried to escape. On November 6, 2003, at Superbike Motorsports in Chesney, South Carolina, Todd Kohlhepp entered the shop and opened fire. He shot and killed Scott Ponder, Beverly Guy, Brian Lucas, and Chris Sherbert. The crime scene was cleaned and Kohlhepp walked away. Investigators had no clear suspect, no witnesses, and no forensic breakthroughs. The case remained unsolved for 13 years. During that time, Kohlhepp built his real estate empire, became wealthy, purchased the 95-acre property in Woodruff, and began preparing it as a site for abduction and murder. Between 2015 and 2016, he lured Charles Carver, Johnny Coxey, and Megan McCraw Coxey to the property under the guise of paying them for labor. He shot them, buried their bodies using a backhoe, and continued operating his real estate business as though nothing had happened. Kayla Brown was also brought to the property. Kohlhepp did not kill her immediately. Instead, he chained her by the neck inside a metal shipping container and held her captive. The premeditation was extensive. He had stockpiled weapons, built infrastructure for captivity and body disposal, and operated in plain sight as a successful businessman. The breakthrough in the case came in 2016 when Charles Carver and Calla Brown were reported missing. Investigators obtained cell phone records and discovered that the last known location of both victims' phones was Todd Kohlhepp's property in Woodruff. On November 3, 2016, Spartanburg County Sheriff's deputies, led by Sheriff Chuck Wright, executed a search warrant on the property. As they searched the grounds, they heard banging coming from inside a locked metal shipping container. They cut open the container and found Calla Brown chained by the neck. Body cam footage captured the moment of her rescue, and the video went viral globally. Calla immediately identified Kohlhepp as her captor. A search of the property revealed a massive arsenal of weapons and the buried bodies of Charles Carver, Johnny Coxey, and Megan McCraw Coxey. Kohlhepp was arrested on the spot. In recorded interviews with investigators, he confessed to all 7 murders, including the 2003 Superbike massacre. The confession solved a 13-year-old cold case and closed the investigation into the missing couples. Rather than face trial and the possibility of the death penalty, Todd Kohlhepp accepted a plea deal. On May 26, 2017, he appeared in Spartanburg County Courthouse before Judge Mark Hayes and pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct. The most damaging evidence against him was the testimony of Calla Brown, the surviving witness who had been chained in the shipping container, and his own recorded confessions to investigators. Solicitor Barry Barnett, the lead prosecutor, presented overwhelming physical evidence, including the bodies, the weapons, and the shipping container where Calla had been held. Kohlhepp's defense attorney, Shane Goranson, negotiated the plea to avoid the death penalty. Judge Mark Hayes sentenced Todd Kohlhepp to 7 consecutive life sentences plus 60 years in prison without the possibility of parole on May 26, 2017. During the sentencing hearing, Melissa Brackman, the widow of Scott Ponder, addressed Kohlhepp directly and told him, "You are a monster." Kohlhepp showed no remorse. He sat in the courtroom staring blankly ahead, displaying no emotion as the families of his victims spoke. In 2018, he attempted to withdraw his guilty plea, claiming that he had been coerced into accepting the deal. The appeal was dismissed. Kohlhepp has since granted controversial media interviews from prison, a decision that has angered the victims' families. Now 53, Todd Kohlhepp is imprisoned at Broad River Correctional Institution in South Carolina, serving 7 consecutive life sentences without parole. His inmate number is 00259-275. The case has been featured on CBS 48 Hours in an episode titled Calla Brown, The Rescue, and in the series Serial Killer, Devil Unchained. The body cam footage of deputies cutting open the shipping container and discovering Calla Brown chained inside became one of the most widely circulated pieces of evidence in modern true crime history. The community was devastated by the revelation that a man who had been showing homes to families and operating a successful real estate business was simultaneously operating a dungeon on a rural property where he chained a woman like an animal and buried the bodies of people he had lured there under false pretenses. The registered sex offender, who had been celebrated as a rehabilitated success story, had been killing people for 13 years. Case 3, Rabbi Fred Newlander. In Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Rabbi Fred Newlander was the founding spiritual leader of Congregation Makor Shalom, a position he had held for decades. He was charismatic, powerful, and regarded as a pillar of moral authority in the South Jersey Jewish community. On November 1st, 1994, his wife Carol was bludgeoned to death with a lead pipe in their home. The murder was made to look like a robbery gone wrong, but investigators quickly determined that the scene had been staged. What they discovered over the next 4 years was that Newlander had hired 2 men to kill his wife for $30,000 so that he could continue an affair with a member of his congregation without the financial and reputational damage of a divorce. To manipulate one of the hitmen into committing the murder, Neulander told him that Carol was an enemy of Israel and that killing her would be a service to the Jewish community. The case became one of the most shocking examples of clergy abuse of power in American criminal history. Fred J. Neulander was born on August 14, 1941, in New York, and was raised in a respected Jewish family. He attended Trinity College and Hebrew Union College, where he was ordained as a rabbi. He founded Congregation Makor Shalom in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and served as its senior rabbi for 29 years. He was married to Carol Neulander, and together they had 3 adult children. Neulander was known in the community as a man of immense charisma and spiritual authority. He preached about morality, compassion, and the sanctity of marriage. Behind that public image, he was having an affair with a congregant named Elaine Sonsini and was embezzling money from the synagogue. By 1994, his marriage to Carol was deteriorating, and he knew that a divorce would destroy his reputation and force him to divide his assets. He decided that murder was the preferable solution. Prosecutors would later describe him as a man with pronounced narcissistic traits who believed he was above the consequences of his actions. Carol Neulander, 52, was a baker and businesswoman who operated a bakery called Classic Cake. She was a mother of 3 adult children and had been married to Fred for 29 years. She was deeply loved by the members of Congregation Makor Shalom and was known in the community for her kindness and her support of her husband's ministry. She had built a life around her family and her work, never suspecting that her husband was planning her death. On November 1, 1994, in the evening, Fred Neulander left his home and went to the synagogue to establish an alibi. Shortly after he left, 2 men arrived at the Neulander home in Cherry Hill. They knocked on the door and told Carol that they had a delivery for the rabbi. When she turned her back to let them inside, they beat her to death with a lead pipe. The scene was staged to look like a robbery. Carol's purse was dumped out on the floor, but valuable items in plain view were left untouched. The 2 men were Len Genoff, a congregant with a history of alcoholism, and Paul Daniels, an associate of Genoff's. Neulander had hired them for $30,000. To manipulate Genoff into committing the murder, Neulander had told him that Carol was an enemy of Israel and that killing her would be a righteous act that would serve the Jewish community. Genoff, who was vulnerable and desperate for Neulander's approval, believed him. Carol's adult son, Matthew, came home and found his mother in a pool of blood. The investigation began immediately, but it moved slowly. The crime scene appeared staged, and investigators noted that valuable items had been ignored by the supposed robbers. Neulander's behavior raised red flags. When police arrived, he asked to use the telephone instead of checking on his wife or showing concern for her condition. The coldness of his reaction was noted by multiple officers. The investigation continued for 4 years without a breakthrough. Then, in 1998, Len Genoff confessed to a reporter. He revealed that Rabbi Neulander had hired him and Paul Daniels to kill Carol, and that Neulander had manipulated him by framing the murder as a service to the Jewish community. Genoff agreed to testify against Neulander in exchange for a reduced sentence. Elaine Sonsini, Neulander's mistress, also testified and confirmed the affair. Neulander was arrested in 1998 and charged with capital murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutor James Lynch led the case, and the state initially sought the death penalty. The first trial took place in October 2001 in Camden County Superior Court. Neulander testified in his own defense and displayed what observers described as extreme arrogance. His demeanor alienated the jury, but the trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial began in October 2002. The trial was moved to Monmouth County for jury selection, but Judge Linda Feinberg presided over the proceedings. Prosecutor James Lynch argued that Newlander had used his immense spiritual authority to manipulate a vulnerable, alcoholic congregant into committing murder. The key witnesses were Len Genoff, who testified about the religious manipulation and the payment, and Elaine Sonsini, who confirmed the affair and Neulander's desire to avoid a divorce. Neulander did not testify in the second trial. On November 20th, 2002, the jury convicted him of murder. The jury deadlocked on the question of whether to impose the death penalty, which meant that Neulander would be sentenced to life in prison instead. In January 2003, Neulander was sentenced to life in prison. The most devastating moment of the sentencing hearing came when his son, Matthew, testified against him. Matthew told the court that his father had played God and had destroyed their family. The testimony was a public repudiation of the man who had once been the moral leader of a congregation. Neulander was incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he remained for more than 2 decades. Fred Neulander died in custody on April 17, 2024, at the age of 82. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. He had served over 20 years in prison. The case became a national story and a symbol of the ways in which spiritual authority can be weaponized to manipulate and destroy. The rabbi who preached morality from the bimah had orchestrated the murder of his wife and had manipulated a member of his own congregation into carrying it out by framing the act as a religious duty. The congregation he had founded was shattered, and the family he had built was destroyed. His son's words at the sentencing hearing captured the essence of the case. Fred Neulander had played God, and in doing so, he had lost everything. Case 4. Nancy Crampton Brophy. The self-published romance novelist who wrote an essay titled How to Murder Your Husband shot and killed her husband in June 2018 at the culinary school, where he worked as a beloved chef and instructor. Nancy Crampton Brophy was 67 years old, financially desperate, and deeply in debt. She stood to inherit over $1.4 million in life insurance policies if her husband Daniel Brophy died. On the morning of June 2, 2018, she drove her minivan to the Oregon Culinary Institute in Portland, walked into the kitchen, and shot Daniel twice with a 9mm Glock handgun, once in the back and once in the chest. She then drove home, disposed of evidence, and called 911 hours later to report that her husband had not come home. The investigation revealed that she had purchased a ghost gun kit online, acquired a Glock at a gun show, and swapped the barrel and slide on the weapon to confuse ballistics testing. Traffic cameras captured her minivan driving to and from the Culinary Institute at the time of the murder, contradicting her claim that she had been home in bed. The irony of the case was inescapable. The woman who had written a detailed essay about murdering a spouse for financial gain had done exactly that. Nancy Lee Crampton Brophy was born in June 1950. She attended the University of Houston and worked various jobs over the years, including as an insurance agent before turning to writing. She self-published a series of romance novels with titles like The Wrong Husband and The Wrong Hero, and cultivated a persona as a quirky, harmless writer in local writing circles. She had been married to Daniel Brophy for 26 years, and to those who knew them, they appeared to be a loving couple. What Nancy hid from public view was the severity of her financial situation. By 2018, she and Daniel were deep in credit card debt, behind on their mortgage, and struggling to make ends meet. Nancy had taken out multiple life insurance policies on Daniel, including one for over $1 million, without his knowledge. She later increased the coverage. Years before the murder, she had written an essay titled How to Murder Your Husband, in which she discussed motives for killing a spouse, including financial gain, and outlined methods for committing the crime without getting caught. The essay would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Daniel Brophy, 63, was a respected chef and instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute in Portland, where he mentored hundreds of students and was beloved for his warmth, skill, and dedication to teaching. He was known in the culinary community as a generous and kind man who took his work seriously and treated his students with respect. He had no idea that his wife had taken out life insurance policies worth over $1.4 million on his life, or that she had been researching how to purchase untraceable firearms. On June 2, 2018, at approximately 7:30 a.m., Nancy Crampton Brophy drove her minivan from her home to the Oregon Culinary Institute in Portland. She had purchased a ghost gun kit online months earlier and had acquired a 9mm Glock handgun at a gun show. To avoid ballistics identification, she had swapped the barrel and slide on the Glock with parts from the ghost gun kit, a tactic designed to confuse forensic testing if the weapon were ever recovered. She parked near the Culinary Institute, walked inside, and found Daniel in the kitchen preparing for the day's classes. She shot him twice, once in the back and once in the chest. Daniel died at the scene. Nancy left the building, drove home, and disposed of the murder weapon and the swapped gun parts. Hours later, she called 911 to report that Daniel had not come home. When investigators arrived at the Culinary Institute, they found Daniel's body on the kitchen floor. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of robbery, and no witnesses. The investigation moved quickly. Traffic cameras in the area captured Nancy's minivan driving toward the Culinary Institute shortly before the murder and leaving the area shortly after. The footage contradicted her alibi, which was that she had been home in bed at the time of the shooting. Investigators also discovered the life insurance policies, which Nancy had increased in the months before the murder. They uncovered her internet search history, which showed that she had been researching ghost guns, untraceable firearms, and how to swap gun parts to avoid detection. The essay, How to Murder Your Husband, was introduced as evidence. In the essay, Nancy had written about financial motives for killing a spouse and had discussed methods for committing murder without being caught. Investigators found records showing that Nancy had purchased a ghost gun kit online and had attended a gun show where she bought a Glock. Shell casings recovered from the crime scene were consistent with a 9mm handgun. Just days after Daniel's death, Nancy asked police to provide her with a letter clearing her as a suspect so that she could begin the process of collecting the life insurance payouts. The request raised immediate red flags. Nancy was arrested on September 5, 2018, and charged with second-degree murder and unlawful use of a weapon. The trial began in April 2022 in Multnomah County Circuit Court. Judge Christopher Ramrus presided. Prosecutor Sean Overstreet presented the traffic camera footage, the life insurance policies, the internet search history, the essay, How to Murder Your Husband, and the evidence showing that Nancy had purchased ghost gun components and a Glock. The prosecution argued that Nancy had been driven by greed and had crafted a plot straight out of one of her own novels. The defense, led by attorney Kristen Wine-Miller, argued that Nancy had not been near the Culinary Institute at the time of the murder, and that the traffic camera footage was inconclusive. Nancy testified in her own defense and claimed that she had no memory of driving her minivan that morning, suggesting that she had experienced some form of amnesia. The claim was not persuasive. The jury deliberated for 2 days and convicted Nancy Crampton Brophy of second-degree murder on May 25, 2022. Judge Christopher Ramrus sentenced Nancy Crampton Brophy to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years on June 13, 2022. Nancy, who was 72 years old at the time of sentencing, showed no visible emotion. The courtroom was filled with Daniel's former students, colleagues, and friends, many of whom had come to honor his memory and witness justice being served. The life insurance policies that Nancy had hoped to collect would never be hers. The essay she had written as a creative exercise became the blueprint that prosecutors used to convict her. Now 73, Nancy Crampton Brophy remains at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Oregon. Her inmate number is 233-48632. She will be eligible for parole in 2047, at which point she will be 97 years old. The case became a media sensation because of the irony at its center. A romance novelist who wrote an essay about murdering a husband for money had done exactly that. Daniel Brophy's former students and colleagues remember him as a mentor and a kind man who loved teaching. Nancy's request for a letter clearing her as a suspect so that she could collect the insurance money just days after her husband's murder became one of the most brazen details in a case filled with calculated deception. Case 5. Alex Murdaugh. On the evening of June 7, 2021, at the sprawling family estate known as Moselle in Islandton, South Carolina, a prominent lawyer and part-time prosecutor shot and killed his wife Maggie and his 22-year-old son Paul at the property's dog kennels. Alex Murdaugh called 911 at 10:06 p.m. and reported finding their bodies. He claimed that he had been visiting his ailing mother and had returned home to discover the murders. What investigators eventually uncovered was that Murdaugh had been operating a decade-long financial fraud scheme, stealing millions of dollars from clients, colleagues, and his own law firm to fund a severe opioid addiction. On June 7, 2021, the day of the murders, Murdaugh's financial crimes were about to be exposed. He believed that a family tragedy would buy him time, sympathy, and a distraction from the looming collapse of his carefully constructed lies. The murders were an act of desperation by a man who had spent years playing the role of a respected attorney while secretly stealing from the vulnerable people he claimed to represent. Richard Alexander Murdaugh grew up in one of South Carolina's most powerful legal dynasties. Born June 17, 1968, he was part of a family whose influence had shaped the state's 14th Judicial Circuit for nearly a century. His grandfather, father, and great-grandfather had all served as solicitors, a position of immense power that the family had held for 87 consecutive years. Alex attended the University of South Carolina for both his undergraduate degree and his law degree. He became a partner at the law firm PMPED, which his family had founded, and also served as a part-time prosecutor. To the community, he was wealthy, politically connected, and seemingly untouchable. Behind the facade, Murdaugh was stealing millions of dollars from clients, including settlements meant for people who had been catastrophically injured. He used the stolen money to fund a massive opioid addiction that consumed thousands of pills per week. By June 2021, his scheme was collapsing. A financial audit was scheduled for the following day, and Murdaugh knew that his thefts were about to be discovered. Margaret Maggie. Murdaugh, 52, was a homemaker and philanthropist who was involved in charitable work in the community. She and Alex had been married for decades and had 2 sons together, Paul and Buster. Maggie was devoted to her family and had no knowledge of the financial crimes her husband had been committing. Paul Murdaugh, 22, was a college student who had been involved in a boating accident in 2019 that resulted in the death of a 19-year-old woman named Mallory Beach. Paul was facing criminal charges related to the accident, and the case had brought significant media attention to the Murdaugh family. Both Maggie and Paul had complete confidence in Alex. On June 7, 2021, at approximately 8:50 p.m., Alex Murdaugh shot and killed his wife, Maggie, and his son Paul at the dog kennels on the Moselle estate in Islandton, South Carolina. Maggie was shot multiple times with a .300 blackout rifle. Paul was shot twice with a 12-gauge shotgun. After killing them, Murdaugh returned to the main house, showered, changed his clothes, and drove to his mother's house in an attempt to establish an alibi. He returned to Moselle at approximately 10:00 p.m. and called 911 at 10:06 p.m., claiming that he had just discovered the bodies. The timeline he provided to investigators was a lie. He told police that he had not been at the kennels that evening and had been napping at the house before visiting his mother. The lie was exposed by a piece of technology Murdaugh had not anticipated, a video recorded on Paul's cell phone. The investigation was led by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED. Investigators processed the crime scene and interviewed Alex extensively. He maintained that he had not been at the kennels and had no idea who had killed Maggie and Paul. The breakthrough came when investigators examined Paul's cell phone. At 8:44 p.m., just minutes before the murders, Paul had recorded a short video at the kennels. The video captured the voices of 3 people: Paul, Maggie, and Alex. The video proved that Alex had lied about his whereabouts. He had been at the kennels with Maggie and Paul minutes before they were killed. When confronted with the video evidence, Alex admitted that he had lied to investigators about being at the kennels, but continued to deny killing his wife and son. As the investigation continued, SLED uncovered the extent of Murdaugh's financial crimes. He had stolen millions of dollars from clients, many of whom were vulnerable people who had suffered catastrophic injuries and were dependent on legal settlements to survive. The financial motive for the murders became clear. Murdaugh believed that a family tragedy would create sympathy and distract from the financial audit scheduled for the next day. Alex Murdaugh was arrested on July 14, 2022, and charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. The trial began in January 2023 in Colleton County Courthouse. Judge Clifton Newman presided. Prosecutor Creighton Waters presented the video evidence from Paul's phone, the timeline of the murders, and the financial crimes that provided the motive. The defense, led by attorneys Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, argued that Alex had no reason to kill his wife and son, and that the real killer had not been identified. Alex testified in his own defense. He admitted to lying to investigators about being at the kennels and acknowledged his opioid addiction and his financial crimes. He tearfully denied killing Maggie and Paul. The prosecution dismantled his testimony by highlighting the web of lies he had told and the financial desperation that had driven him to murder. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours and convicted Alex Murdaugh of all charges on March 2, 2023. Judge Clifton Newman sentenced Alex Murdaugh to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole on March 3, 2023. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Newman addressed Murdaugh directly and spoke about the betrayal of trust that defined the case. Murdaugh had used his position as an attorney and a member of a powerful legal family to steal from vulnerable people, and he had murdered his own wife and son in an attempt to cover up his crimes. Family members of Maggie and Paul were present in the courtroom, and several spoke about the loss they had suffered and the devastation Murdaugh had caused. At 55, Alex Murdaugh is imprisoned at McCormick Correctional Institution in South Carolina, serving 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. His inmate number is 0039 394. The case became one of the most closely watched criminal trials in recent American history, in part because of the fall of a powerful legal dynasty, and in part because of the audacity of the crimes. A respected officer of the court had stolen millions from paralyzed clients to fund a massive pill addiction, and when his financial house of cards was about to collapse, he murdered his wife and son at the family estate. The lies unraveled entirely because his son had taken a random Snapchat video of the family dog minutes before being executed, and that video captured Alex's voice. The legal dynasty that had held power in South Carolina for nearly a century ended with a double murder and 2 consecutive life sentences. Case 6. Dr. Bradley Schwartz, the pediatric ophthalmologist, had built a successful practice in Tucson, Arizona, performing delicate eye surgeries and earning respect in the medical community for his technical skill. Dr. Bradley Schwartz was also addicted to prescription drugs, including Vicodin and Ritalin, and had been arrested by the DEA for diverting controlled substances. In 2004, a former business partner named Dr. David Brian Stidham left Schwartz's practice and opened a competing ophthalmology clinic nearby, taking patients and revenue with him. Schwartz, who was in severe financial distress as a result of the DEA arrest and the loss of patients, decided that the solution was to have Stidham killed. He hired a hitman named Ronald Bigger for $10,000, established an alibi by having dinner with an ex-girlfriend at a crowded restaurant while the murder took place, and waited for the phone call confirming that Stidham was dead. On October 5, 2004, Stidham was stabbed 15 times in the parking lot of his medical office. Schwartz was convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Bradley Allen Schwartz was 39 years old. In 2004, he had earned a medical degree and specialized in pediatric ophthalmology. He worked in Tucson, where he had built a successful practice treating children with eye conditions. His patients' families relied on him, and his surgical skills were highly regarded. Behind that professional image, Schwartz was struggling with severe addiction to prescription drugs. He abused Vicodin and Ritalin and had a history of diverting controlled substances from his practice for personal use. In 2003, the DEA arrested him on charges related to prescription fraud. The arrest devastated his reputation and his finances. Patients left his practice, and his income plummeted. One of the doctors who left Schwartz's practice was Dr. David Brian Stidham, a 37-year-old pediatric ophthalmologist who had worked as Schwartz's partner. Stidham was ethical, well-liked, and respected in the medical community. After Schwartz's DEA arrest, Stidham decided to leave the practice and open his own clinic nearby. Many of Schwartz's former patients followed Stidham to the new clinic, leaving Schwartz financially desperate and consumed with resentment. David Brian Stidham, 37, was a pediatric ophthalmologist who had worked with Schwartz before deciding to leave and start his own practice. He was married and had young children. He was known as a man of integrity who had walked away from Schwartz's practice because he did not want to be associated with a physician who was abusing drugs and engaging in illegal conduct. He was respected by his colleagues and loved by his patients' families. On the evening of October 5, 2004, he was working late at his medical office in Tucson. Bradley Schwartz hired a man named Ronald Bigger to kill David Stidham. Bigger was a street criminal with a history of violent crime, and Schwartz paid him $10,000 to carry out the murder. On October 5, 2004, Schwartz established an alibi by having dinner with an ex-girlfriend at a crowded restaurant in Tucson. While Schwartz was at dinner, Bigger went to Stidham's medical office and waited in the parking lot. When Stidham left the building and walked to his car, Bigger attacked him and stabbed him 15 times. Stidham died at the scene. A cleaning crew discovered his body shortly after the attack. Bigger fled the scene but left behind forensic evidence that would eventually link him to the crime. The investigation began immediately. Detectives processed the crime scene and recovered DNA evidence that would later be linked to Ronald Bigger. Investigators also obtained cell phone records that showed constant communication between Schwartz and Bigger in the days before and after the murder. Multiple ex-girlfriends of Schwartz came forward and testified that Schwartz had openly discussed wanting Stidham dead. One former girlfriend told investigators that Schwartz had referred to attractive mothers in his clinic as GLMs, which stood for good-looking moms, and that he routinely abused prescription pads to obtain drugs for himself. The forensic evidence, the cell phone records, and the witness testimony built an overwhelming case against Schwartz. He was arrested on October 15, 2004, and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The prosecutor's office brought in attorneys from Pinal County to handle the case due to conflicts of interest in Pima County, where Schwartz had professional connections. The trial began in March 2006 in Pima County Superior Court. Judge Nanette Warner presided. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence linking Bigger to the crime scene, the cell phone records showing communication between Schwartz and Bigger, and testimony from Schwartz's ex-girlfriends about his statements regarding Stidham. The defense, led by attorney Brick Stortz, argued that Schwartz had not been directly involved in the murder and that Bigger had acted on his own. The argument failed. The evidence of conspiracy was overwhelming. The trial resulted in a mistrial on the direct murder charge due to a deadlocked jury. But Schwartz was convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, which carried the same sentencing weight as a murder conviction. Ronald Bigger was also convicted and sentenced separately. In 2006, Judge Nanette Warner sentenced Bradley Schwartz to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The sentencing marked the end of a medical career that had once been dedicated to healing children and had devolved into drug abuse, financial desperation, and murder for hire. Schwartz was incarcerated at an Arizona state prison facility where he has remained for nearly 2 decades. He will be eligible for parole around 2029. At 59, Bradley Schwartz remains imprisoned at an Arizona state prison complex, where he has served nearly 20 years of his life sentence. The case became a subject of national media attention, including coverage on Court TV, which streamed portions of the trial. The image of a wealthy pediatric ophthalmologist hiring a street criminal to solve his professional grievances captured the public's attention and became a symbol of how far a person can fall when addiction and financial desperation take hold. David Stidham was murdered because he had the ethical fortitude to walk away from a colleague who was breaking the law. His widow and children were left to grapple with a loss that was entirely preventable. Bradley Schwartz, who once healed children's vision, will spend the rest of his life in prison for orchestrating the death of a man whose only crime was refusing to be complicit in illegal conduct. Case 7. Pamela Hupp. On August 16, 2016, a woman named Pamela Hupp called 911 from her home in O'Fallon, Missouri, and reported that she had just shot an intruder who had broken into her house and attacked her. When police arrived, they found the body of a man named Louis Gumpenberger, 33 years old, lying on the floor with 5 gunshot wounds. Hupp told investigators that Gumpenberger had been sent to kill her and that she had shot him in self-defense. The story was a lie. Gumpenberger had not broken into Hupp's home. He had been lured there by Hupp herself, who had posed as a producer for the television show Dateline NBC and had driven around looking for a vulnerable target. Gumpenberger, who suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities as a result of a prior car accident, had been an easy victim. Hupp shot him, planted a fake ransom note and cash in his pockets, and called 911 to claim she had been attacked. The motive for the murder was to distract police from reopening the investigation into the 2011 death of her friend Betsy Faria, a case in which Hupp had been the sole beneficiary of a $150,000 life insurance policy just days before Betsy was murdered. Pamela Marie Hupp was 57 years old in 2016. She had worked as an insurance agent for State Farm and was married to a man named Mark Hacking. She lived in suburban Missouri and was known to neighbors as a busybody who inserted herself into other people's business. She had been a close friend of a woman named Betsy Faria, and in December 2011, Betsy was found stabbed to death in her home. Betsy's husband, Russ Faria, was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was later overturned, and Russ was acquitted in a retrial after evidence emerged suggesting that Pamela Hupp had been involved in Betsy's death. What investigators discovered was that just 3 days before Betsy was murdered, Hupp had convinced Betsy to change the beneficiary of her life insurance policy from Betsy's daughters to Hupp herself. Hupp collected $150,000 from the policy after Betsy's death. By 2016, investigators were preparing to reopen the case and take a closer look at Hupp's role in Betsy's murder. Hupp decided to create a distraction. Louis Gumpenberger, 33, was unemployed and suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities as a result of a car accident he had been in years earlier. He was vulnerable, financially struggling, and easily manipulated. He had no connection to Pamela Hupp and had never met her before the day she killed him. On August 16, 2016, Pamela Hupp drove around O'Fallon, Missouri, looking for a vulnerable person she could lure to her home and kill. She posed as a producer for the television show Dateline NBC and told potential targets that she was looking for someone to participate in a sound check for an upcoming episode. She eventually encountered Louis Gumpenberger and convinced him to get into her car. She drove him to her home, brought him inside, and shot him 5 times. She then planted a fake ransom note in his pocket that referenced Betsy Faria's husband, Russ, in an attempt to frame him for a murder-for-hire plot. She also placed cash in Gumpenberger's pockets to make it appear that he had been paid to kill her. After shooting him, she called 911 and reported that an intruder had broken into her home and attacked her. The 911 recording captured Hupp shooting Gumpenberger while he was completely passive and unarmed. The investigation unraveled Hupp's story almost immediately. GPS data from her cell phone showed that she had been tracking Gumpenberger's movements before bringing him to her house. The 911 recording revealed that she had shot him while he posed no threat. Investigators also discovered that Hupp had previously been the sole beneficiary of Betsy Faria's $150,000 life insurance policy just days before Betsy was murdered, and that she had a financial motive to distract police from reopening that case. Hupp was arrested on August 23, 2016, and charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Prosecutor Tim Lomar led the case. Rather than face a trial and the possibility of the death penalty, Pamela Hupp entered an Alford plea in June 2019. An Alford plea allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to secure a conviction. By entering the plea, Hupp avoided the death penalty, but accepted a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The most damaging evidence against her was the GPS data showing that she had tracked Gumpenberger, the 911 recording, capturing her shooting him while he was unarmed, and the fake ransom note she had planted to frame Russ Faria. Pamela Hupp was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in June 2019. She is incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri. Her inmate number is 1335043. In 2021, she was subsequently charged with the murder of Betsy Faria, the friend whose life insurance policy she had collected after Betsy's death. The case became the subject of intense media coverage, including the hit podcast The Thing About Pam and an NBC miniseries starring Renee Zellweger. Pamela Hupp, now 65, serves life without parole for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger and faces additional charges in the death of Betsy Faria. Louis Gumpenberger was a completely innocent man who was murdered simply because Pamela Hupp needed a corpse to use as a prop in an elaborate lie designed to deflect police attention from her involvement in another murder. the fake ransom note, the planted cash, and the staged 911 call were all part of a plan so callous that it shocked even seasoned investigators. Russ Faria, who had been wrongfully convicted of murdering his wife and had spent years in prison before being exonerated, was nearly framed a second time by the same woman who had likely killed his wife in the first place. The case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of premeditated violence carried out not for financial gain or revenge, but simply to create a distraction from an earlier crime. Case 8. Michael Gargiulo. In the neighborhoods of Hollywood and El Monte, California, a friendly air conditioning repairman and part-time bouncer named Michael Gargiulo offered to fix broken heaters and air conditioners for his neighbors, many of whom were young women living alone. He was handsome, charming, and helpful, and he made copies of their keys so that he could return to finish repairs when they were not home. What his neighbors did not know was that Gargiulo was using his access to their homes to study their routines, their floor plans, and their vulnerabilities. Between 2001 and 2008, he murdered 2 women and attempted to murder a third, attacking them in their bedrooms in the middle of the night with a knife and stabbing them with such ferocity that investigators described the crimes as overkill. Ashley Ellerin, a 22-year-old fashion student, was stabbed 47 times in her Hollywood home in 2001. Maria Bruno, a 32-year-old mother, was stabbed to death in her El Monte home in 2005. Michelle Murphy survived an attack in 2008 when she fought back and caused Gargiulo to cut himself, leaving his DNA at the scene. That DNA linked him to all 3 crimes and led to his arrest, conviction, and death sentence. Michael Thomas Gargiulo was born in 1975. He worked as an air conditioning repairman and bouncer and lived in the Los Angeles area, where he cultivated relationships with neighbors by offering to help with household repairs. He was handsome and personable, and people had faith in him. What they did not know was that Gargiulo had been suspected of murder before. In 1993, when he was 17 years old, a young woman named Trisha Picacho was stabbed to death outside her home in Glenview, Illinois. Gargiulo was a suspect in that case, but he was never charged. He moved to California and continued the same pattern, befriending young women, offering to help with repairs, and using that access to plan and execute brutal attacks. Ashley Ellerin, a 22-year-old fashion student, was preparing for a date with actor Ashton Kutcher on the night of February 21st, 2001. She was living in Hollywood and getting ready to go out when she was attacked in her home. Maria Bruno, 32, was a mother living in El Monte, California, when she was killed on December 1st, 2005. She was stabbed to death in her home and found by her estranged husband. Michelle Murphy, 26, was asleep in her Santa Monica apartment on April 28, 2008, when Gargiulo broke in and attacked her. She fought back, and during the struggle, Gargiulo cut himself. He fled, but the blood he left behind became the evidence that solved the case. On February 21, 2001, Michael Gargiulo broke into Ashley Ellerin's home in Hollywood. Ashley was preparing to go out on a date with Ashton Kutcher, who later testified that he had arrived at her house around 10:45 p.m., looked through a window, saw what he thought was spilled red wine on the floor, and left when she did not answer the door. What he had seen was blood. Ashley's roommate discovered her body the next morning. She had been stabbed 47 times. The crime scene suggested extreme overkill and a level of rage that went beyond what was necessary to kill. On December 1st, 2005, Maria Bruno was stabbed to death in her home in El Monte, California. She was found by her estranged husband. The crime scene was similar to the Ellerin case: extreme violence, multiple stab wounds, and no clear suspect. The cases went cold. On April 28, 2008, Gargiulo broke into Michelle Murphy's apartment in Santa Monica while she was sleeping. He attacked her with a knife, but Murphy fought back. During the struggle, Gargiulo cut himself and bled on Murphy's bedspread. He fled. Murphy survived and gave investigators a description of her attacker. The blood Gargiulo left behind was tested, and the DNA was entered into databases. The DNA matched evidence recovered from the Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno crime scenes, linking all three attacks to the same person. Investigators identified Michael Gargiulo as the suspect through the DNA match. They learned that he had been a neighbor or acquaintance of all three victims, and that he had used his job as an air conditioning repairman to gain access to their homes. He had made copies of keys, studied their routines, and returned in the middle of the night to attack them. Gargiulo was arrested on June 6, 2008, in Santa Monica. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The trial began in May 2019 in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Judge Larry Paul Fidler presided. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence linking Gargiulo to all 3 attacks, testimony from Michelle Murphy about the night she was attacked, and evidence showing that Gargiulo had been a neighbor or repairman for all 3 women. The most high-profile witness was actor Ashton Kutcher, who testified about arriving at Ashley Ellerin's home on the night she was murdered and looking through the window to see what he thought was spilled wine. Kutcher's testimony was surreal and widely covered by the media, as it placed a celebrity at the scene of a brutal murder on what was supposed to have been a casual date. The defense did not present a credible alternative explanation for the DNA evidence or the pattern of attacks. On August 15, 2019, the jury convicted Michael Gargiulo of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Judge Larry Paul Fidler sentenced Michael Gargiulo to death on July 16, 2021. The sentencing marked the end of a case that had spanned nearly 2 decades. Gargiulo was also awaiting extradition to Illinois to face charges in the 1993 murder of Tricia Picaccio, the case that had first brought him to the attention of law enforcement. At 48, Michael Gargiulo awaits execution on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. The case became known as the Boy Next Door Killer case because Gargiulo had used his persona as a helpful, friendly neighbor to gain access to the homes of women he then attacked and killed. Ashley Ellerin's murder took on additional notoriety because of Ashton Kutcher's involvement, and the surreal image of a Hollywood actor testifying about arriving for a date while a killer was likely still nearby became one of the most discussed aspects of the trial. Maria Bruno's family was left to grapple with the loss of a mother whose life was stolen by a man who had pretended to be helpful. Michelle Murphy's survival and her decision to fight back were the reasons the case was finally solved. The blood Gargiulo left on her bedspread was the evidence that connected him to 2 unsolved murders and brought justice to the families who had been waiting for answers for years. Case 9, Shanna Liz Goliar. In November 2012, a woman named Carrie Farver disappeared from Omaha, Nebraska. Her family reported her missing, but text messages from Carrie's phone continued to arrive for months and then years after her disappearance. The messages were disturbing, erratic, and threatening. Carrie's mother received texts claiming that Carrie had run away to start a new life. A man named Dave Krupa, who had been casually dating Carrie, received tens of thousands of texts from Carrie's phone accusing him of infidelity and threatening violence. Carrie's car was vandalized. Dave Krupa's property was vandalized. A woman named Shanna Liz Goliar, who was also dating Krupa, received threatening messages from Carrie and even had her house burned down in an arson attack she claimed was Carrie's doing. The text continued for 4 years, creating the impression that Carrie Farver was alive, psychotic, and stalking everyone connected to Dave Krupa. In reality, Carrie had been murdered in November 2012, and the person sending all of the messages was Shauna Golyer, who had killed Corey, stolen her phone, and impersonated her for 4 years, in what became the most elaborate cyber hoax in criminal history. Shanna Elizabeth Golyer was 33 years old in 2012. She worked as a housekeeper and was a single mother. She had been casually dating a man named Dave Krupa, a mechanic in Omaha, Nebraska. The relationship was not exclusive, and Krupa was also seeing other women, including Carrie Farver. Golyer became obsessed with Krupa and consumed by jealousy when she learned that he was seeing Corey. She decided that the solution was to eliminate Corey and frame her as a dangerous stalker so that Krupa would never suspect what had really happened. Carrie Farver, a 37-year-old computer programmer, had met Dave Krupa online and had begun seeing him casually. She was a mother who lived in Iowa and had no idea that Krupa was also dating Shauna Golyer, or that Golyer was planning to kill her. On November 13, 2012, Carrie Farver disappeared. What investigators later determined was that Shauna Golyer had killed her, likely by stabbing, and had disposed of her body in a location that has never been found. After killing Corey, Golyer stole her phone and began an elaborate impersonation scheme. For the next 4 years, Golyer sent tens of thousands of text messages from Carrie's phone to Carrie's mother, to Dave Krupa, and even to herself. The messages she sent to Krupa and to Carrie's mother claimed that Carrie had run away to start a new life and did not want to be found. The messages she sent to herself were threatening and violent, designed to create the impression that Corey was stalking her. Golyer vandalized Dave Krupa's property and her own property, including slashing her own tires and spray painting threatening messages on her own garage. In 2013, she set fire to her own house and claimed that Carrie had done it. She even shot herself in the leg and told police that Carrie had attacked her. The entire scheme was designed to make everyone believe that Carrie was alive and psychotic. The investigation into Carrie's disappearance began in 2012, but was complicated by the constant stream of text messages from Carrie's phone. Investigators initially believed that Carrie had run away and was alive. The breakthrough came when detectives Ryan Avis and Jim Doty of the Douglas County Sheriff's Office began analyzing the pattern of the text messages. They noticed that the texts from Corey were only sent when Shauna Golyer was near a cell tower or had access to a computer. They also discovered that Golyer had been impersonating Corey online and had created fake email accounts in Corey's name. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Golyer's electronic devices. On her tablet, they found a deleted photograph that showed Carrie Farver's dead body tied up in the trunk of a car. The photo had been taken shortly after the murder. Investigators also found blood matching Carrie Farver under the upholstery of Golyer's passenger seat. The evidence proved that Golyer had killed Carrie, stolen her identity, and carried out a 4-year campaign of deception to cover up the murder. Golyer was arrested in December 2016 and charged with first-degree murder and arson. Rather than face a jury, Shauna Golyer opted for a bench trial, meaning that a judge, rather than a jury, would decide her fate. The trial took place in August 2017 in Douglas County, Nebraska. Judge Timothy Burns presided. The prosecution presented the text message evidence, the deleted photograph of Carrie's body, the blood evidence from Golyer's car, and the pattern of vandalism and arson that Golyer had carried out against herself to create the illusion that Carrie was stalking her. The defense did not present a credible alternative explanation. On August 15, 2017, Judge Burns convicted Shauna Golyer of first-degree murder and arson. Judge Timothy Burns sentenced Shauna Golyer to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing brought an end to a case that had spanned 4 years and had involved one of the most elaborate cover-ups in modern criminal history. Golyer had not only murdered Carrie Farver, but had also destroyed Carrie's legacy by making the world believe that Carrie had abandoned her family and become a dangerous stalker. Gollier filed an appeal, which was denied by the Nebraska Supreme Court in 2018. Shauna Gollier, 46, is imprisoned at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, serving life without parole. The case became the subject of the Netflix documentary, Lover, Stalker, Killer, which was released in 2024. Carrie Farver's body has never been found. Her mother and her son were left to mourn a woman whose life was stolen and whose reputation was destroyed by someone who wanted to take her place in a casual, romantic relationship. The tens of thousands of text messages, the arson, the self-inflicted injuries, and the 4-year impersonation campaign were all carried out by a woman who believed that if she could make everyone think Carrie was alive and insane, no one would ever suspect that she had been murdered. Case 10, Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan. On the covers of fitness magazines in the early 2000s, bodybuilding champions, Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan were the image of health, discipline, and success. They were professional bodybuilders who had won national competitions, appeared in major publications, and were treated as royalty in the fitness industry. They lived in Las Vegas, drove luxury cars, and cultivated an image of glamorous, muscular perfection. On December 14, 2005, in the desert outside Las Vegas, emergency calls reported a vehicle fire in a remote area. Firefighters extinguished the blaze and discovered the body of a woman in the trunk. The car was a red Jaguar, registered to Kelly Ryan. The woman in the trunk was Melissa James, 28 years old, who had been living with Titus and Ryan as their personal assistant. She had been beaten, tased, injected with morphine, and suffocated or strangled before her body was wrapped in fabric and set on fire in the desert. Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan fled across the country to Boston, where they were arrested after a cross-country manhunt. The case revealed a private life of extreme drug addiction, paranoia, and violence that stood in stark contrast to the disciplined, healthy image they projected to the public. Craig Michael Titus was 40 years old in 2005, and Kelly Ann Ryan was 33. Both were professional bodybuilders who had achieved significant success in the sport. Titus had competed at the highest levels of bodybuilding and had been featured in major fitness publications. Kelly Ryan had won the Ms. Fitness America title and was known in the industry as one of the top female competitors. They were married and lived in Las Vegas, where they maintained a high-profile lifestyle. Behind the image of health and discipline, however, Titus and Ryan were consumed by severe drug addiction. They abused narcotics and anabolic steroids, and their private lives were chaotic and violent. Melissa James, a 28-year-old woman, had moved in with them to work as their personal assistant, managing their schedules and helping with daily tasks. What was supposed to be a professional arrangement became entangled in the couple's drug use and volatile relationship. Melissa James, 28, was living with Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan in their Las Vegas home and working as their personal assistant. She was managing their schedules, running errands, and becoming increasingly enmeshed in their lives. According to later testimony, an argument erupted between Melissa and the couple over allegations of embezzlement, drug theft, and an affair between Melissa and Titus. The argument escalated to violence. On December 14, 2005, in the Titus and Ryan residence in Las Vegas, an explosive confrontation took place. The exact details of who did what remain contested, but what is clear is that Melissa James was beaten, tased with a stun gun, injected with morphine, and either suffocated or strangled. After killing her, Titus and Ryan wrapped her body in fabric, placed her in the trunk of Kelly Ryan's red Jaguar, and drove the car to a remote area in the desert outside Las Vegas. They purchased lighter fluid at a Walmart, and security footage captured them making the purchase. They poured the lighter fluid over the car and set it on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence. Emergency calls reported the fire, and firefighters arrived and extinguished the blaze before the trunk was completely destroyed. Inside, they found Melissa James's body. The car was registered to Kelly Ryan, which immediately made her and Titus suspects. Taser prongs were found embedded in Melissa's body, and forensic analysis determined that she had been injected with morphine before being killed. The investigation moved quickly. The Jaguar was registered to Kelly Ryan, and surveillance footage from Walmart showed the couple purchasing lighter fluid shortly before the fire. Titus and Ryan fled Las Vegas and drove across the country to Boston, where they had family. A cross-country manhunt was launched, and on December 21, 2005, they were arrested in Stoughton, Massachusetts. They were charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and arson. Prosecutor Robert Daskus led the case. Days before their trial was scheduled to begin in 2008, Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan both accepted plea deals to avoid the death penalty. On August 22, 2008, they appeared in court for sentencing. Craig Titus pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, kidnapping, and arson. He was sentenced to 21 to 55 years in prison. Kelly Ryan pleaded guilty to arson and battery with a deadly weapon. She was sentenced to 6 to 26 years in prison. The plea deals meant that there would be no trial and no public airing of all the details of what had happened in the house that night. The evidence that had been gathered, including the Walmart surveillance footage, the forensic analysis of Melissa's body, and the testimony about the drug use and paranoia, was enough to secure the guilty pleas. Craig Titus, now 58, is held at Lovelock Correctional Center in Nevada and will be eligible for parole around 2026 or 2027, having served approximately 21 years. Kelly Ryan was granted parole and released from prison on October 24, 2017, after serving approximately 12 years. She divorced Titus after her release. Melissa James was murdered by two people who had posed on magazine covers as the epitome of health, discipline, and success, while their private lives were completely consumed by extreme drug addiction, paranoia, and violence. The image they sold to the public was a fiction. The reality was a chaotic, violent household where a young woman who had come to work as an assistant was beaten, tased, injected with drugs, and burned in the trunk of a luxury car in the desert. The fitness industry that had celebrated Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan as champions was forced to reckon with the fact that the bodies on the magazine covers had been built not just through discipline, but through substance abuse that led to murder.